Hi, Dr. David. It's so great
Hey,
to have you
Tammy.
here. It's an off month for you, but I'm really grateful you're here with all the schedule changes. So if somebody's watching a recording, please note, watch the calendar for recordings and join us live sometime. Please join us live. Then you get to ask questions. So we love
Live
that.
is fun. Live is fun. And with summer travel, we bump
I
things
know.
around. So,
Yes,
yeah,
yes, but
people got
we're
to keep on their
flexible.
toes. Right. Right. So, yeah, there's so much we could talk about, and I want to hear from people and what their questions are. But I also want to just do a little talk in the beginning, just to remind people the new book, not the newest book, because we have the porn book out now, but Sex Under the Influence, which
Hold it
I
right in
wrote.
front of you.
Yeah, so it
There
was.
you go.
Right. I should turn off my blurry background. But this was
It's all
published
good.
by Seeking Integrity, and I'm really proud to author that. A lot of the work on combining different kinds of addictive behaviors and substances has really focused on specific populations. And at Seeking Integrity, we see increasing every year more and more people getting involved in these kind of behaviors. And then speaking of arousal templates, these drugs, particularly amphetamines, expand that. And so we're seeing a lot of, straight guys who are having sex with other men or with transgender women or men. Of course, we talked about this last time, is everybody's asking, like, is my husband gay? What's going on here? So that certainly is a consequence of this. But I wanted to mention one other more subtle detail just to start, and then we can open it up, about what we call sexualized drug use, and how sometimes we get a lot of people whose primary addiction is certainly sex and or porn and acting out. And they may have a little bit of alcohol, a little bit of cannabis, or they wouldn't consider it a problem necessarily. And what we often work with the guys seeking integrity is, let's look at your whole ritual. You're talking about the very specific kind of outrageous acting out behavior, but what do you do before and after? And what we've discovered is that more and more people, it's a drink or two drinks or a little smoking on a joint, right? It's these little things that start the whole big process. It may not be that alcohol or cannabis is the primary problem, but every time they take a drink or two, suddenly, or take a toke, then suddenly they're looking at porn, or they're looking at escort sites, or so it kicks off the whole thing. So I think it's really important to have that awareness of, it's just not just the one substance, but how all these other substances and behaviors we tack on around it. And then the other side, we see that after the acting out, that remorse phase, the shame, oh my God, I've done it again. What's the impact going to be on my relationship and my marriage? Then they often then also medicate that, right? Often alcohol, other things to numb, food. We know that a lot of guys move toward carbohydrates and food to kind of numb the guilt and the shame that they're feeling. So I think it's important for all of us to kind of just expand our horizon a little bit on how these substances and things may act together. It may not be the primary one, but it certainly is part of the ritual. And I think and this is, I think, a lot of well-meaning therapists, even CSATs across the country, don't put together the whole package. And I think and ultimately maybe it's going to be up to somebody whether they want to give alcohol or not, if they could convince sex and porn or amphetamines is their primary problem. But I think it's helpful to have a realistic look at that. Well, every time you have a drink, then you go down the rabbit hole, right? And so just that connection, I just wanted to paint a little more detail, because it's something that I think a lot of traditional therapists have missed, where okay, let's focus on the porn and the sex and the pain in the marriage and the crisis that's happened. And they kind of ignore the stuff around the edges, which is still a part of the ritual. So that was my point here today. I just wanted to make that connection. And if you want more information about this, the book has a lot of stuff. What I'm really proud of in this book, one of the things actually, is that more than half of it is tools and resources. And so for people who are struggling with these connections between sex and drugs, sex and porn, or sex and any other behavior, it's a real important way to look at it, and how we kind of put together the whole addictive concept for people. So I think it's important. Check out the book and see what happens. I
Do
think you'll
check
find
out the
it very
book.
helpful.
Yeah. And for some people, like, ask your therapist if they've read it, because I think, You know, like we do that with codependence too. It's like if your therapist hasn't read codependence, there's a clinical book for that, you know, like, but I hear, and you know, this too, that, you know, we get so many clients that come in and go, oh, alcohol or cannabis isn't really an issue. And I'm like, well, you're going to stop that while you're coming to our residential treatment program.
Exactly.
And we're going to explore all those things. And the holistic, I use that word a lot, the holistic, we are really looking at everything. And, you know, the eating, you know, the food is an easy one to, you know, to go to, but it can be exercise, whatever we're doing compulsively
Exactly.
to escape, you know, you know, and it can be good for you, things like exercise. But if it's like, I'm always doing this and I'm doing it compulsively, and I, you know, like, so we have to be mindful of things. And I'm really curious about, like, you know, because I do think often people go, oh yeah, I have a drink, and then the next thing I know, you know, all of these things happen. And I always kind of wonder, is there this little thing of like, well, I'm telling myself I'm only gonna have a drink, you know, I'm only gonna have one drink, you know, and but like in the back of our minds, we kind of know exactly where this is going to lead,
Oh
you
yeah.
know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah. And I'm
Yeah.
really curious too of like, okay, like if it's really not a problem, how often do people like have one drink and that's it, and then nothing else snowballs from there? I mean, I have no clue. Maybe you do.
You know, I think once it gets integrated into the ritual, right, into that the sort of stages that lead up to it, and we know that a lot of, well, most addicts, but I think especially sex and porn addicts are kind of compulsive about these behaviors, the planning, the rituals, the preoccupation, the getting ready, you know, blocking out their calendar, getting times, arranging things. All that is kind of part of the, and we know we do an exercise at Seek Integrity with guys talking about this process, a guy going out to get cocaine and sex. And when is he actually getting high, right? And he starts to get high long before he ever puts drugs in his body. He starts to get high when he starts to think about what he's going to do and start to call his dealer and lay out the, you know, then he's starting to get the dopamine and he's already high. And there's actually physiological consequences, right? Our pupils get smaller. We don't see stuff around us. Our judgment gets bad. So, and again, stone cold sober, if we drug tested that person, but, and they haven't acted out yet, but they are on the way. So that's where I think it's important for people to view the whole episode, right? Before, after, not just the one acting out moment. That's really critical. But I think, yeah, I think once it's part of that ritual, I think it's something that's very dangerous that people really need to take a look at. You know, I wanted to mention one other thing that occurred to me. We got a letter last week, or an email from an old colleague of mine who I used to know when I worked in the same company. He was in Chicago, I was in Florida. He's now in Minneapolis as a kind of doing counseling and referrals. And he wrote about this new book, Sex Under the Influence. He said it's been so helpful for non-gay people who have this problem, because there's this belief that chemsex, or this combination of sex and drugs, is a problem for gay folks and not my problem. And he said these guys and women also didn't feel seen, right? They didn't, and so I think therapists can miss that. So I think it's another important piece. If you or your husband or your partner are struggling with this, like, well, that's not my issue. That gay people do that. Take a look at this book, because there's all the examples are both men and, there's always, for any concept or point I might point out, there's always a male example and a female example, because that's also really under-recognized, is what a big problem this is for women. But anyway, the book covers all that, and I think that's an important point to mention also.
It is, and you know, I was cheering you on to write this book because, like, I was like, this is coming in, you know, for lots more than just meth and gay men sex, you know,
Exactly.
and problematic, because you're right, people automatically assume that, and the other aspect of this is we have so many people that go running off to substance use disorder programs and mistakenly thinking that if I just stop the substances, then everything is going to be
The
better. And
sex will take care of
unfortunately,
itself.
yes,
Yeah.
and unfortunately, that's the belief in the substance programs for a lot, you know, for many programs. It's just like, all you got to do is, you know, stop the chemicals, and then you're, you know, like that's, and the definition of sobriety for substances is abstinence. But it's so much more complicated. Again, why
Exactly.
we talk about the holistic and looking at, you
Exactly.
know, anything that we're doing compulsively, you know, gaming, gambling, you know, like like there's so many things. I'm an addict. I can be addicted to anything, and I have to pay attention to those. Anything that I'm getting You know, like I have to dial it down, you know,
Exactly.
even like I
Eh,
said, the exercise, it's like I have to be mindful of like, yeah, if I don't work out today, I'm not gonna like, you know, die, you know, it's gonna be okay, you know.
yeah, exactly.
There's a life lesson, but go ahead. You were saying.
Tim, I was just going to say, you know better than I do, but at any given time at Seeking Integrity, we have several clients, if not half the clients, who've gone through substance abuse treatment somewhere, right? The sex and porn thing was never mentioned, never brought up, and they continue to relapse. And why can't I get sober in the drugs? Well, you can't get sober in the drugs because you're still an active addict in sex and porn. And the solution is complicated. You're exactly right. At that point, if somebody's crossed that line, the answer is abstinence from the substances. But then how do we reintegrate sex back into our lives, which we want to do? And oftentimes then that get into the pattern. As soon as I have any kind of sexual contact, I relapse on drugs. You know, that's the fusion that we're talking about here that is largely unrecognized by even a lot of therapists, sadly. And some of the finest treatment centers in the country who do drug treatment just don't recognize this. So it's my pet peeve, honestly.
Well,
We're doing a disservice to people.
and I agree. And our model is not, oh, just keep coming back. Like we don't want the revolving door on our treatment program. We honestly, we want clients to get what they need to be in recovery for the duration. Their plan is holistic. They have support to be successful with it if they choose to, you know. We have varying lengths of treatment, and we identify if this, then 14 days, if that, then 21 days, if this, then 28 days. With co-occurring substances, 28 days is the best fit. We have some people that extend beyond that or do a step down. Like we look at each person individually. It isn't just plug them into the program and we're going to do the same thing with you that we do with everybody. You know, it's like each person, you know, their struggles are similar but unique, and so their aftercare plan has to be effective for them to be able to continue, you know, after they leave us. We don't want to hear, of course we'll help if, you know, if somebody's relapsed, but we've got, you know, alumni groups that guys are coming to and they're talking about their life struggles. You know, how do I do my relationship, how do I do whatever? You know, it isn't just like, oh, I'm hanging on by my fingernails, you know, of like, you know, not acting out, you know. But we sure would want to know that before they act out, you know, if that was the
Exactly.
case,
Yeah.
you know, too. So yeah, I mean, I'm grateful to be part of Seeking Integrity. You know, integrity is key to us. And part of integrity is not just like, yeah, keep coming back, you know, like that's not it. But, and like, I can only imagine, like, I'm grateful I got to go to treatment. Why do I say that? I got to go to treatment. That wasn't how I was feeling when I left for treatment, but
Right.
yeah, scared to death. But you know, I had the benefit. Not everybody gets a chance, but you know, I had the benefit of treatment, and you know, like they gave me enough so that I've been able to continue in this journey. I don't know, you know, if I would have been able to keep going to other programs. So I honor people who, you know, are going like, I'm going to give it another try, because like it has to be really disheartening, you know, to struggle with the ongoing relapses even after
Yeah.
treatment. So
Yeah. The shame and the stigma and all that is the job
yeah,
we do
well,
in
and time
ourselves.
and money and everything
Yeah.
else. It's like,
Yeah.
oh my
All of
gosh,
it. All of
yeah,
it.
you've checked out of your life for a period of time. One guy came to us, this was years ago, but he came to us and he'd been to 9 different treatment programs. And I mean, my heart broke for him, and he had a spouse, you know, like, and younger children, as I recall too, you know, like I was just like, oh my gosh, you're missing out on life because of your
Exactly.
addiction, and it's stealing your life from you.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
I'm a cheerleader fan of recovery. Can you tell? Can you tell? So, okay. All right. So let's get started with some questions. After a
Cool.
15-year severe porn, masturbation, and fantasy addiction, I've been sober for 2 years now. Ever since becoming sober, however, I lost my sex drive. Is this part of the withdrawals process, or do I need to actively rewire my sex drive? Clear medicals and sensate focus have been tried. Thanks. You know, and like this rewiring, like I've been hearing this, and I keep thinking, all these people think if I just get the soldering gun out, then I can rewire all of these things, and that isn't true. But this is talking about arousal template and, you know, and sensate focus. So what are your thoughts? Like, Dr. David is actually uniquely qualified in this area, so words of wisdom.
Yeah. So first of all, thanks to this person for sharing. I think this is a common phenomenon. I see it a lot where people kind of have an initial period of no sexual interest or arousal, sometimes in early recovery, because it's all the crises and problems and consequences. And I think oftentimes people begin to fear sex and reintegrating sex. And that goes, of course, there's also issues of complications of the relationship and trust and all that. But I think there is a phenomenon where people can drop into kind of this sexual anorexia in recovery, right? Where because they're afraid if I engage in sex, I'm going to relapse on drugs or behaviors or all of the above, and so they kind of put it off. And I think time alone is not the answer, right? We talk. There's no magic number for days of abstinence, but we think I like 90 days. Some people like longer. Some people don't do it at all. But I think a period in the beginning where you're not sexually active is very useful because it does stop reinforcing those old behaviors. Now, the trick here, and I think this is what I encourage you to look at, I have discovered and I've come to be more respectful of the power of fantasy. And so oftentimes I see guys in recovery or women, it works the same, where they are not acting out, they're not doing their bottom line behaviors, they're not even doing their yellow circle behaviors, right? They're doing everything they should, but they're still up in their head thinking about stuff. And I think that can really slow down this recovery process. Every time we think about an old using fantasy, or every time we think about getting a little titillation from something, and it can be inadvertent. We can be driving by the motel where we used to meet our affair partner every Wednesday afternoon. That's enough to kind of trigger it. And just like that 3-second rule, we have to like not indulge that stuff because every time we light up those old fantasies related to our addictive behavior, it slows down or stalls the process. And so when I see somebody who has a considerable time in recovery like this, like 2 years plus, I'd really encourage you to look at that idea of where does your mind go, and just be careful about not indulging fantasies. The other thing is that most of us have used alcohol and drugs and other kind of addictive behaviors to override issues we had about sex in the first place. And that could be, body image issues. It could be intimacy. Dr. Rob talks about every addict having an intimacy disorder. And I totally agree with that. We don't know how to do vulnerability and trust. And part of that is the trauma experiences we've had. And I mean, it makes sense, right? But it's not helpful if we're trying to reintegrate sex. My first book, Lust, Men, and Meth, it was about chemsex in the gay world. It's universal applications here. The subtitle I originally started was something like Reclaiming Healthy Sex and Intimacy. And I realized we're not reclaiming anything. I think most addicts I know, myself included, didn't have a clue about that stuff until I got sober and started working on it. And so when we get sober, we don't have the tools, the addictive behaviors that kind of get us past the hump to act or act out, I should say. But now we have to deal with all that stuff that we kind of thought was behind us, whether it's issues of shame or concepts about sex or those negative core beliefs, I'm unlovable, that a lot of us get from trauma experiences, all these other issues. So I hope you're seeing a CSAT or therapist. At this point, you may have done some trauma therapy, but I think Sensei Focus is great. I love it. But I think it's also, you might want to see and process with your therapist or your sponsor or people, your support group, what are some areas where I might be slowing myself down, that other areas that need to heal, that were there before the addiction ever even happened, right? Because that's the stuff now that starts to get in the way of sexual integration in a healthy way. And for me, it's that fantasy, and typically it's that intimacy stuff, being vulnerable, really feeling safe, having trust, and all. And that goes, of course, for the partner too, and more so in the partner. But all these issues can really slow us down. I think that's what I would focus on there.
So Dr. David wrote a curriculum, Healthy Intimacy. There's a work group, and I just put the link in for that, and the other work groups. You'll find them on that site. So that could be an option. But you mentioned something, the issues that were there before that we masked with all of this stuff, and I thought, wow, I can't, the fear of and it's just way nicer to keep it all tamped down and not have to like if I'm not aroused, then I don't have to deal with any of those things. And exactly. if I was aroused, then I'm going to have to fear about ooh, I'm going to have to confront some of those really challenging, issues. So like, I think, 95% of stuff is, like I run. 95% of running is mental, like your body needs to do it too, but like it's my attitude. But I was thinking, man, oh man, if I'm scared and fearful and body images and all that kind of stuff, I could really make myself compartmentalized on that area, so that I don't even have to, like, well, I'm not even aroused, I don't have to deal with that.
And you hit the word, and I was going to mention it, the compartmentalizing, right? Every addict is compartmentalized, where we have uh, different, segments in our mind, all metaphorical, of course, but where we have a public facing, front facing, this is me in public, but every addict has these kind of secret compartments in the back, right? That not many people, if anybody, knows about. The thing is, with reintegrating sex and intimacy in a healthy way in recovery, is that we have to break down those compartments, because the stuff that hit out in those back door compartments, really have to be front and center. And again, to bring it back to seeking integrity, what is integrity? It's integration. It's integration of those compartments. So we don't have compartments anymore. It's just us. And I think that's easier said than done, because some of the stuff we tuck away back there is, old trauma responses and body shame and stigma, and who knows what's back there, right? But we have to confront that and bring it into the daylight in order to heal and get back. Because I think that's going to be a barrier to really having satisfying sex and intimacy in a healthy way in recovery.
And like, honestly, I'm grateful that you're asking these questions, because I hear the desire to be integrated, and being willing is, like, you haven't given up. So yay, I'm glad you're here asking.
Absolutely. And by the way,
Okay.
2 years,
Go ahead.
no small achievement. So yeah,
Right.
good stuff. Good stuff.
Right. My husband blames his extreme cannabis use for his online acting out. How much of this could be true?
Well, we talked about a few minutes ago about how the connections, right? And very often, cannabis especially, and I don't want to get off on my cannabis rant, but cannabis is kind of legal in a lot of places, and the idea of dangerousness, and cannabis is not methamphetamine for sure, but it's not benign. And I think, especially, by the way, for developing brains, that's, I get so upset with kids smoking cannabis, because that's when it's really doing the damage on their developing brain. Adults kind of have more of a choice, and the brain damage doesn't occur so much. The damage is that it occurs as part of this ritual, and it can really, I've seen guys, a lot of guys, who would get high and on cannabis, and when they do, it puts them in that mindset, and that porn and cannabis is a real powerful combination that needs to be recognized. And if we only just, well, it's the porn is the problem, don't worry about the cannabis so much. No, we have to look at both. So for your husband, I would say he definitely has to ditch the cannabis. I would say get rid of that cannabis and other mood altering substances. I think, though, to blame it totally on the cannabis is a stretch, because there's other active addictions here going on as well. And so the online acting out, and by the way, that's a perfect combination, because online acting out is all in your head. It's like porn, it's fantasy, it's low risk from a vulnerability point of view, and cannabis puts you right into that space where you can kind of focus. Basically, cannabis drops you in that back compartment we were talking about before. You live back there, you don't have to worry about all this other stuff. And so I think it's important for him to look at the cannabis, get rid of the cannabis, and I think that's going to be key to really stopping the acting out, because that, whether it is just the initiating kickoff, or if it's runs through, cannabis is definitely associated now with that mindset, and I think it's going to be important. Now, I think he has to also take some kind of the devil made me do it thing here. It's like, yeah, the cannabis is a problem, but he's got to take some ownership of his own acting out and taking responsibility for that. You can't totally blame it just on the cannabis, but I think the cannabis is a factor that's going to affect his recovery from that if he doesn't cut that out. And yeah, stop there.
Yeah, and I'm kind of like, who cares? Like, this goes to everybody wants to know why. The why is, we say this all the time. The why is interesting, but it isn't that, what do I need to do to stop these problematic behaviors? How do we move forward in a different way? Those are more useful questions. And this almost feels like, like, I'm wondering, I'm grateful you're here, but I'm wondering if he's just going like, yeah, the cannabis is making me watch the online, and so he's using this as an excuse to do both, and is he seeking recovery? Is he looking to change? Because if he is, then yeah, I agree with Dr. David. Like, again, at Seeking Integrity, we're looking across everything holistically. Smoking, vaping, like none of that is okay. So it's we have to be live an examined life, in recovery. But if he's just using it as like, yeah, this is the reason and this is my excuse. I was just talking to somebody earlier today, and I'm like, yeah, these issues usually start before age 10, and we just find different ways of, different maladaptive coping ways, so that these behaviors feel like they're the problem. They're a symptom. It's like
Exactly.
the stuff that Dr. David was talking about a few minutes ago too. What are those underlying issues? So for you, partner, I'm going to suggest strongly healthy boundaries. What do you need to do to take care of you? We have an online work group starting for betrayed partners on the 21st of July. The link is in the chat, but it's on Seeking Integrity. And that will help you get healthy boundaries for you, regardless of what the addict is doing or not doing. I encourage you to start. You got no control over an addict, but you sure can work on creating safety for you. So, okay, next question. Since becoming sexually aware 20 years ago, I have historically always fantasized about a fetish scenario, threesomes, to become aroused during self-pleasure and self with partner, regardless of partner. I struggle to be aroused without fantasizing about this fetish. How may I stoke arousal without fantasy, but rather aroused by straight vanilla sex and a physical partner?
Really good question. I think it's not unusual for people to get very specific in their certain kind of fantasy behavior, and those get what we call deeply grooved. Those things, they become like automatic. So it's not unusual for somebody to kind of not even want to go to that fantasy, but their brain takes them there. It's like the horse that knows how to get back to the barn on the trail, right? It doesn't need somebody leading the way. Our brains, we've trained our brains how to do that, how to get us into that space. And so you're kind of fighting your own brain to an extent early on, because that deeply grooved pattern is going to be where your automatic go-to, and that results, as you pointed out, in this dependence on that behavior to be aroused, right? And that's also something that happens kind of in the advanced stages of this addictive behavior. So a couple of things. When we talk about arousal templates, that in this case, threesome fantasy would be one area of your arousal template. There's many others, right? But you focus on that. That's become the central. That's become the bright hotspot in your arousal template. And I think the strategy here is to let that die down and kind of let the flame go out there. So again, if we think of arousal template metaphorically as kind of having hot spots in it, that one is kind of the bright spot you go to automatically. We need to kind of distract ourselves and go to other places. The problem is, early on, nothing else is as interesting or exciting or arousing as that. And we see this all the time with chemsex too, where you have amphetamines just stoking up these really high-powered fantasies, and like not everything else pales and is boring. That's the word I hear a lot from clients. So it's going to be boring and vanilla, and so I would encourage you to distract yourself. We know from an aspect we call neuro-linguistic programming. If I tell you to don't think about it, don't think about that fantasy, you're going to go right there. Don't think about an elephant. You just pictured an elephant. So the brain doesn't work that way. So the only way we can do is to distract ourselves. So instead of going there, actively go somewhere else. Try some other fantasy, and it's probably not going to be as interesting as in first, but I think it's going to be important to not linger on that old fantasy, because every time you go there, it's going to reinforce it. Now, the other thing here is that because it is not as much dopamine initially, so it can seem not as interesting and even boring sometimes. But I think this is where we have to really learn and accept the difference between addictive kind of sex and sexual acting out versus kind of healthy sex and intimacy. And hate to say it, but in recovery, the sex and intimacy is going to be different. I'm not going to say better or worse, but it's going to be different than that high intensity focused fantasy that we've developed over a period of years or decades in our lives in this case. So I think we have to really look at, okay, what else can I do? And this is where the idea of what is intimacy? Well, it's why we wrote those work groups. What are intimacy skills in terms of vulnerability and trust and empathy and compassion and all these things that we need to know that addicts basically don't know. And in my experience, so we kind of missed that handbook somewhere. And so I think it's fair to kind of work on those issues, and that really makes, in my opinion, sex and intimacy in recovery, not in that fantasy world of, that particular fetish idea we have, but with connection with another person or with ourselves. If we talk about masturbation sometimes in a healthy way, but really that makes it much more interesting, because a lot of sex addicts go for the intensity of the acting out behavior, and intimacy can certainly be intense when you're with someone and involves someone, but there's many flavors of that, right? It's always not intense. Sometimes it's soft or gentle or just relaxing or safe, or so I think start to have an appreciation of the subtleties of connected, healthier sex than the high intensity voltage of that fantasy. I think that takes time to do that shift. And a lot of guys think, oh, it's not going to happen. But it does happen. And I'd encourage you in your meetings to talk to people who have been in recovery for some time. Talk to them about how they maneuvered this, because this is a common thing where we have to kind of let certain parts of our arousal template that were activated during our addiction, we have to let it kind of dry down, dry out, go out, and we have to reinvent it, if you will, in another way. Now, I'll say one more thing about arousal templates. We know that arousal templates, once there's something in that arousal template, it basically is there to stay, right? So, and this is the part of the long-term damage of addiction. If through my addiction I've gone through tolerance and escalation, and say if I'm a porn addict and suddenly the kind of porn I'm interested in has gotten really kind of extreme, and because that's where I go to get the dopamine hit, that taste for extreme porn is never going to go away. It's always going to be in my head. What we have to learn to do is kind of not feed it, just let it die down. 10 years from now, if you want to go rummaging through your arousal template, you can light that up again. It's still there. But after a while, and I know this from my own recovery, we forget about it. Other things take precedent. Other things become more interesting. So we don't even want to go back and reactivate it. And so it's a long process, but I'd encourage you not to feed that particular fantasy you want to let extinguish and distract yourself in another direction.
So with this, it feels like if I'm not doing that, then it's boring, and I think vanilla gets a very bad rap because vanilla is like a fantastic flavor. And I suspect if you really unpacked all the layers of vanilla, you would appreciate it, more. So just like you're saying, no, it's like, if it's not that, then it's boring, and I think also it's easy to get stuck in our heads that like, for sure, like if I can't do this, then, but like you said, all the nuances and things like this might also be someone who could benefit from the healthy intimacy work group, a kind of understanding what real intimacy and connection is, because yes, it's different, but like, Dr. Rob did a webinar, I think it was on June 3rd, but he looked up the top 15 words for intimacy, and none of them were sex, and so when addicts are seeking intensity, it's not intimacy and connection. And so understanding that, intimacy is like really being connected in a meaningful way, and it's so much richer, and more meaningful, but it's not that woohoo, intensity. And like you were talking about with chemsex too, it's different, and some aspects of it, if you put better or worse or whatever, but it's different and can be so much more meaningful, if we're willing to do it.
Let me add one thing.
Please.
My sex therapist hat. When we as addicts become dependent on fantasies for arousal, right? And that's exactly what happens. So it's what you're describing here. So we can't get aroused unless we're in that fantasy in our head. And as I said, these often become very focused and specific. That's one method of arousal. And the unfortunate thing about that is that without drugs or active addiction, we can never get there, right? If we're just trying to get aroused based on fantasy alone. That's why we say it's boring or not interesting, because we can't get there. So I would encourage you to go to Plan B, Plan B is to use your body, breathing, get in touch. Somebody mentioned sensate focus earlier. That's on Masters and Johnson touch exercise for couples, basically, beautiful exercise. But what it does, it uses a different system of arousal. It gets our bodies involved. And I think get out of our heads. You said it, Tammy, like get out of our heads and focus on breathing. Look up breathing techniques, and that's what I do recommend for couples, and not even in addiction, but couples in general who are having issues. Like, let's breathe together. So we can use our bodies. Our bodies know how to get aroused without fantasy. But believe me, it's a natural response if you're connected in a safe and healthy way. The other thing I'll just mention, research shows we can start to really appreciate this. I don't want to keep reinforcing the boring, but the concept of sex that's uninteresting. If the sex gets much better if we can start to practice sensual awareness, meaning in a mindfulness kind of way. Practice tasting your food, practice enjoying, seeing the beautiful colors, smelling the flowers or the blossoms, all that. If we can heighten that. And I think generally men in our culture tend to be less tuned into that stuff. But I think that's also a very specific way to improve satisfaction with one's sex and intimacy, is that increased level of sensuality, which is awkward for a lot of men. But we need to get over it and move on, because it really does help. Really does help.
We need to get over it. I agree. Okay, my partner and I have no alcohol addiction issues. However, I have suffered from sex addiction, historically sober now. My partner, however, is sexually inhibited, very conservative, and really opens up sexually after 1 or 2 drinks. I am not concerned for potential alcohol addiction, but concerned for the potential pairing of the two. We are only 2 drinks, or we only try drinks with sex on weekends strictly. Can this lead to issues with sex where sex without it becomes unsatisfying? That's a great question. They're all great questions. Thank you. These are interesting ones. Yeah.
They're interesting and totally relevant. I think, based on what we said before, a couple of drinks can be kind of a significant part of the pattern. And it may not be, falling down drunk leading to that, but it may be leading to one's sexual behavior becoming dependent on a drink or two, right? That's what we're talking about here. I think and alcohol is classic for disinhibiting. So a lot of people use that to move past any inhibitions they may have about that kind of connection, intimate connection. So I'd really encourage you both to start practicing without alcohol and see what comes up. Again, breathing. I can't overemphasize how important breathing is in terms of just relaxing the body, getting grounded, becoming present, getting in the space, and that opens it up. And it may be that there may be some work here. I don't know, of course, the history of either of you, but there may be a trauma history. A lot of times these other issues are kind of lurking in the background, and things like alcohol or cannabis can help us, close the door on those temporarily and disinhibit us. But we then become dependent, as I mentioned, on those drugs to do that. So I would really encourage you to explore, or your partner to explore, what the issues are there. That why is alcohol necessary? What is it numbing? What is it disinhibiting? What's it doing? And see if there's other ways that you could kind of get past those blocks. And I do think, it may not lead to full-blown alcoholism, but I think it sure could lead to sexuality becoming dependent on a drink or two to function. And I wouldn't want to see you going in that road.
And so, and this is making an assumption that your partner is female, but I put the Empowered Women Retreat information in, and we talk about our bodies. We talk about, we do this amazing breath work thing. It's just crazy good. But there's so much stuff in there. But I would suspect that your partner would have the ability to get some layers down. But otherwise, to me, this is like an opportunity for your partner, to identify the issues that are holding back. Because this feels like a compartmentalized too. I'm compartmentalized until I have a couple drinks, and then I don't have to be compartmentalized. So being congruent for your partner would be a gift as well. Both of you showing up, as your real selves, would, I hope, be meaningful. So the link is in there. Happy to answer questions about that as well. We have only a few spots left for the August retreat. Okay. Follow up on the sex drive question. Tried multiple 90+ days, complete abstinence periods, and have been engaging sexually with loving partner over 2 years. No change. Very blessed life. No significant trauma. Any tips to increase sex drive in a healthy way? Best to see a sex therapist or CSAT, given it's been 2 years of sober.
Um, yeah, a couple things. So make sure that you've had a physiological workup, right? Sometimes there's a hormonal issue with men and women, of course, but that can sometimes be an issue if there's no sex drive at all. I assume that's pretty routine these days to levels of testosterone and estrogen, things like that, see how they're balanced. That could be a factor. I would recommend probably a CSAT. I'm also I'm both a sex therapist and a CSAT. And I think they both have a lot of advantages. The problem with some sex therapists is that they really undermine the issue of sex addiction. There's a great controversy right now and among sex therapists, many of whom minimize the behavior and say there is no such thing as sex addiction. I think that's incredibly harmful to people because clearly there is. People are suffering, and to be kind of told that's not a problem. You're just being, sex positive. Well, no, I'm causing a lot of damage to my marriage and myself and grief and so choose carefully if you decide to see a sex therapist who that person is. I think it's probably a safer bet to see a CSAT who they CSATs have, of course, the addicted training, some of the sex training, not all the sex therapy training, but enough, I think, to really help you in this. And yeah, so again, kudos to you for kind of pursuing this. You should be getting some return of that functioning right now. So there's something, I would guess, kind of blocking that. And as I say, rule out the physiological first, but then start exploring with a CSAT or a sex therapist who's on board with the concept of sex addiction to really see if you can make progress there. Because really, this requires somebody to kind of look at the whole picture, right? The whole what else is going on, and that's where I think you can get a lot of good ideas about what those solutions might be.
Yes. So I will find the link for IICS. And because look for somebody who is a CSAT and IICS, that would be a good option. I'm doing that right now. But I also, you mentioned the sex therapy world and the sex addiction world. Jeff Goodman just posted in Psychology Today, and I put the link in.
Yes.
Dr. Jeff Goodman. It was a brilliant article, and
Yep.
I mean, Psychology Today has prevented Dr. Rob from using certain terms, for years and years, and he's like one of their top bloggers. This feels like we're starting to see a shift. So hopeful that people will align it, because otherwise, what the heck? There's no help. Like if there is, when I was identified as having addiction, it was like, oh, thank goodness, there's something I can do about this. Otherwise,
Exactly.
what is I'm just crazy because I keep doing these things. So no comments. But yes, there's some crazy, but it's like there was a plan, there was help. Like I could live differently. I live congruent. I don't have compartments. I don't have to anymore because I can show up as the same person, whether it's work or home or wherever, and that's helpful. So I will put that in. I'm going to read you the next question. 33-year relationship, marriage, first disclosure 7 months ago. Oh gosh, more than one. Starting recovery efforts only this past month. Why are we seeking these distractions, sex, fantasy, alcohol? We are both addicts in our partnership in different ways. My last session with a CSAT, she suggested strongly we start a 90-day sexual abstinence time. As the betrayed partner that is trying to still attach, even in early betrayal education, this feels impossible and unfathomable to stop all sex and other addictions, even though it has caused clear harm. What is the underneath stuff we need to get to and heal? Sorry for the confusion in the question. It's not confusing. I get it.
Yeah, I know. A lot packed in there too. First of all, again, all these questions, people are really looking for answers and really trying and hang in there. And I just have such respect for that whole process. I think there is some benefit from periods of abstinence, depending on the situation. I just want to say it's like a trial separation, though. If you it's not enough just to do the time, to do 90 days and then expect something miraculous to change. I think what the 90 days does is buy you some time without the distraction of sex, to allow you to work on some of these underlying issues that you asked to be identified, right? So I think it's useful. It can be. What I would encourage you to do, by the way, is talk to your CSET about your reaction here and what that means, and because it sounds like this whole idea of 90-day abstinence period has a lot of underlying meaning and significance for you in other ways. So I would talk about that with your CSAT. But I think what we're looking at when I do this with clients to kind of buy some time is to kind of get away from those deeply rooted fantasies we talked about earlier in the arousal template, where we're just kind of always in that state. And by the way, we can, as addicts, we can be in that preoccupied state all day long. I mean, we can be in our minds kind of semi-distracted from our daily lives, sort of semi-functional, but not really totally present, because we're always stuck up here. So really starting to become aware of those thought patterns. Where does my mind go? When does it go there? What are my triggers? When I'm bored, when I'm upset, when I'm feeling a need for validation, the personal patterns that may be kicking this stuff off is going to be important. The other thing I'd encourage, and this is where the 90-day from absence can really be helpful, is intimacy issues, the idea of vulnerability, trust, compassion, empathy, all those things that we struggle with sometimes, that really this is a terrible analogy I'm making up on the spot, but it's like if we take a ship that's having problems and we put it in dry dock, and so we can kind of work on it without it being in the water and all that. It's kind of it eliminates one thing. That's the idea here, is that we can kind of put something in a place where we can minimize the distractions and work on specific issues. So what those are really depends on people, but to generally categorize them, I think they almost always include trauma related events and consequences that impact our intimacy skills, meaning vulnerable. Am I able to be vulnerable with anybody? And what's my level of trust? How do I feel about myself? What are my core beliefs? And especially negative core beliefs. And a lot of times we'll see, and these are just under the surface, things like I am or I am not, right? I am unworthy, I'm unlovable, I'm unsafe, people leave me, people hurt me, whatever those beliefs about ourselves and the world are, they may need to be adjusted, right? And that may be those beliefs no doubt made sense oftentimes in our lives when we come out of certain situations, but they're no longer a good fit for our lives. So just kind of looking at all that stuff as a way of kind of changing and getting ready for treatment. I would just to put in a plug for the work groups. I think the work groups are great areas where this stuff is talked about in a safe way. I've did a number of the work groups on healthy sex and intimacy, and it was like a little group session, right? These guys were very supportive with each other, and we talked about it, and very vulnerable, and we could actually talk about these skills. And it's a way to explore the specific stuff that's directly relatable to your recovery. I think it's a nice forum in a way that we don't often get access to help solve those things.
So in addiction, we do it one day at a time. And I got really caught up in times, like always and never and forevers and all of that kind of stuff. And so I would invite you, you're seeing your CSAT every week. Can you make it till next week when you see your CSAT? Can you do just today? Can you this morning, make a commitment, just for today, we're not going to, I'm not going to, it's not even we. We often hear partners are the ones that instigate, sex during the time out. And it's because I'm trying to attach, but you're trying to attach in a physical way that is not the intimacy and vulnerability. It's a pacifier kind of connection. It's like, oh, I feel good in the moment, a little endorphins or whatever, but it's not real connection, because the addictions are going to continue to keep those, keep you meaningfully, keep you from being meaningfully connected. I put in the chat previously recorded webinars, Dr. Rob, I mentioned it earlier, the 15 forms of 15 words for intimacy. None of them were sex. And then Troy Love does a great job with attachment wounds, and like I suspect as a partner, feeling abandoned, feeling betrayed, all of those things. And if we just have sex, then I'm going to feel better. Yes, you're going to feel better in the moment. And that's what every addict does. Like I'm running off to use my maladaptive coping mechanism and I feel better in the moment, or I feel numbed out. And then, it's the same cycle. So you guys can stay on that cycle of addiction. That's another one. Scott has done the cycle of addiction on webinars. You'll see that. Yeah, like Sex Addiction 101 work group would be a great one, to start with. If, there's so much, we have so much. And I hear you caught up in the, oh my God, 90 days. But you know what? At 91 days, just like Dr. David said, it isn't like magic. And now we're all going to be fixed. That just gives you the dry dock, analogy actually was a good one. It gives you an opportunity to really examine things. And this is a lot. You've been together 33 years, and you know what? You can keep going with these problematic patterns. We hear that a lot. Or you can go, we deserve better. We want more meaning. Dr. Rob did a podcast with Dr. Stan Tatkin. It's January 2019, so it was one of the early ones. But like, I love that one, and I refer people often because in a healthy relationship, we are focused on the relationship and we are healthier, we are happier, like lots of good stuff happens for us individually if we're focused on, a healthy relationship. So I think that would be, is that what you want? Not everybody does, but if you do, then what do you need to do? And what can you do in this day that will, break those, those patterns, like these patterns, you guys have been doing them for 33 years.
It's a dance.
Yeah. I always say it's the negative two-step. We do the, and you've worn a pattern out on the floor. And if you want something different, like, what do you want? 3 years from now, you can be in the same negative space, or you can choose, just for today, I'm going to do something different. And then tomorrow, just for today, I'm going to work on things in a different way. It's really freeing because I just have to do it for today. Sometimes break it down for 10 minutes, for the next
Totally.
10 minutes, can I do this?
One other thing too, and it's 33 years, I think still there's a lot of communication work probably need to be done. And I'd recommend, as a way to stay connected, a daily check-in. If you guys aren't doing those, it's a nice way to stay connected and kind of provide some of that intimate connection. Not sex, but it really helps each other understand where you're at, what's going on. So that daily contact in terms of check-ins are really important, I think.
Okay. I went to treatment in 2018 for chemsex, and I've been sober from alcohol and drugs since, except for amyl nitrates. I seem to have developed an addiction to poppers. You hear this often. I mainly use them alone while watching porn. I can't seem to put them down. I throw them out usually and then end up buying more a few days later, and the cycle goes on like this. As a gay man in recovery, it seems like poppers are a gray area. I bet you disagree, but I am experiencing negative consequences from my use of them. Not sure how to stop. We have a residential treatment program. Like my heart goes out. We have a residential treatment program. This is not benign. This is like, and I get so frustrated because, like, well, in the gay community, we can use poppers. Like, that's so please, I'll shut up.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I'm a gay man in recovery myself, and I understand how poppers are, a big part of the community out there. Poppers, again, are not a benign drug. They're a very strong drug that, drop your blood pressure and put you in this headspace that's extremely seductive for an addict, but it's also really strong associated with sex. And so I'm not surprised you feel you can't put them down, because the two go together. I've had people in treatment who were porn addicts and popper addicts, and without the poppers, they couldn't get as high as they wanted to on the porn. So again, we've talked about fusion of these things. They're fused for you, clearly. Poppers are not benign. I think a lot of times one of the struggles we have in the community is that we somehow think poppers, and now I'm hearing more increasingly cannabis, that those are kind of passes on that. And on the East Coast where I live, it's called California sobriety. And you don't talk about that in California. There's no such thing, but we're making that up, saying, well, they use poppers and marijuana, I'm still sober. No, clearly it's unmanageable. You've written that very eloquently, that these things are causing you problems. I think when you talk about this level of loss of control over it, throwing them away, and that's such classic addictive behavior, I would suggest some kind of treatment structured program at some level. I'm not sure residential, although I know you could benefit from residential, but an ILP or a PHP to deal with this, because it's not just a small issue. The same thing with cigarettes, by the way. You know, cigarettes are equally damaging, but poppers create more of a head rush, and I'd really be cautious about it. So this is something I think beyond what you can probably do by yourself. I admire the fact you're in recovery from chemsex per se, but this is like a vestige of that. And I think I'd really focus on that to get the help you need to break the cycle. This is a case where I think a period of abstinence of 90 days or so would be really helpful with a lot of tools to help with that. And I just want to say, if you don't come, I myself run a Tuesday evening chemsex support group. You can find the link in Sex Relationship Healing at 5 p.m. Pacific.
I'm gonna put it in right now. So
It's a beautiful group. We got about 20 guys maybe, and we have a very active WhatsApp chat all week long. There's a lot of support exactly around issues like this. So I'd really encourage you to join that group if you can. But I think it's just classic that we kind of minimize the danger of some of these drugs, and poppers are one of those that just because they're around, and boy, they cause a lot of damage. So do be careful.
So do you have a hard stop at, because we have a bunch of questions. Can we do a couple more?
A couple more, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Have you ever encountered addicts who suffer pause, including sex drive for 2 years? I've made it through the other symptoms such as lack of sleep, irritability, brain fog, etc., but experience lack of nocturnal morning erections and libido, clear blood hormones. Is this pause, PAWS, related in your opinion? I don't even know what that means. So
Yeah, so pause is post-acute withdrawal syndrome.
oh, thank you.
It is a phenomenon. By definition, pause goes out to 6 months. And after 6 months, typically we don't consider stuff pause. And things, you name some of them here. It can be all kinds. It can be sleep problems. It can be weird physical sensations. It can be mood swings and all that stuff. That's, you know, the drugs and the behaviors are kind of behind us now, but we're still having these vestiges of kind of dysfunction as we go through. 2 years is quite far out to be considered pause. So again, there may be something else going on here. I'd get a full workup. I'd talk about this with your therapist if you see one, because I wouldn't, off the top of my head, attribute this to post-acute withdrawal. I think you're beyond that. Not that it's not related to your addiction somehow, but 2 years is still out there. Now, nocturnal morning erections, you know, I don't know how old you are. As we age, those get less. So I think a lot of times too, and this is the flaw with some of the men's physical health stuff where they're looking at all the testosterone levels and all that, is that we want to keep acting like we were in our 20s, right? And as we get older, our sex doesn't disappear. We have sex across the lifespan, but the form changes. We start to get more benefit from touch and less of the kind of performative stuff. And so it may not be a normal or abnormal that you don't have morning erections, right? That could be just something that goes with aging. They shouldn't disappear altogether, but you know, things like that do change over time. So our expectations may need to be adjusted. But I think I would certainly pursue this, because there's probably something else going on here that you could benefit from finding answers for. I don't have them off the top of my head, but I would guess it's not pause.
My SA addict partner, when his addiction was uncovered, went down a dark path and attempted suicide, which was interrupted by me. I realized after that I developed a trauma bond. We are both trying to have our own individual healing paths, him for his addiction and me for my betrayal trauma. How do we break a trauma bond without losing the other intimate parts of our relationship? Or will it always be there because of the severity of the incident?
Wow. Poignant question here. That is a trauma, of course, to interrupt a suicide like that for anyone. But that trauma bond, I suspect that the aspects of it were there before that, right? We find people that in a subconscious way we have this kind of affinity for, and oftentimes those are based on trauma bond responses. I think it's totally possible for you to kind of heal from that without losing each other, but it's going to be really reconfiguring, retooling the relationship and how you connect, and kind of reconfiguring that in a healthier way, where there's less responsiveness, less interest, I think, and that's the wrong word, but compulsive kind of interest in the other person. Like boundaries are going to be important for you guys, and really communication is going to be key, because I have seen couples where the trauma bond was so significant there wasn't much else left around it. I just based on your question, the fact you're asking the question, I think and you're interested in this, I suspect there's a lot there that you can work with that's not related to that trauma bond in terms of connection. But like we mentioned earlier today, when those kind of hotspots in our arousal template, that becomes the dominant thing that we see in a trauma bond relationship. The trauma bond becomes the dominant bright spot, and we don't see the other things around us, other ways of connecting. It's going to be a matter of taking the emphasis off the trauma, the elements of the trauma bond, and learning how to reconnect in a healthier way, in a safe way. And that may mean a little bit of separation, first, or distancing or whatever to interrupt the process. Because after a while, these bond processes, they become automatic and they kind of roll forward on their own. So you may have to kind of take a step out of it somehow, whatever that means, and to reconfigure it. But I think it's totally possible. Absolutely.
So the next question is, this will be our last. So how do you approach unwilling addicts in your practice?
Yeah, so let me just start by saying there's some research from substance use disorders that it doesn't matter how someone enters the process, the results tend to be the same. So I can have somebody who's court ordered to go to treatment, who doesn't want to go, who's they're fighting it. If they can really get there and last, and ultimately they have to buy into the process at some point, they can have equally good responses to anybody else. So I think it's not unusual for people to resist this, because what are we talking about? We're talking about dropping out of our coping skills, right? Giving all those up, and then having to face some really hard work on other things that we've been numbing out or avoiding or compartmentalizing or whatever it is. So I think the way I do it is try to have some compassion. Like, where is this person coming from? What's going on? What are the barriers? What's this resistance about? And try to make it a win-win. There's a kind of therapy called motivational interviewing, where we look at, okay, what's important to you? And let's work with that. And so maybe you want to have less strife in your marriage. Maybe you want to be a better parent for your kids, but when we take whatever can be an agreed upon goal, we try to find that and then work with that. Use that as the kind of the door opener, if you will, into the process. But eventually they're going to have to buy in or not. But if they don't buy into the process, the outcome isn't very good. But what that does, it buys us time to let's talk on the same page, as opposed to getting in a power struggle, which doesn't end well, right? I'm not going to get in a power struggle with somebody because they're just going to dig in. It's not productive. But if we can find common ground and work with that, I think that's the way forward.
Yeah, so Dr. Rob, does one-time expert consultations with couples, and often, he's listening for the difference between what the partner is saying and what the I'm going to use addict is saying, because there's a big disconnect. And for some, he's really good at helping navigate that space and helping go, look, there is help, and here's how it could be approached. And for some partners, honestly, they go, I'm validated that my addict is not willing to do any work. So healthy boundaries, you can stay in the relationship. You can have joy and not have the addiction be the focus of your life. But boy, it's harder, because you've got to really focus on how do you take care of you, knowing that you're living, with an active addict. For some, they go, yeah, I'm using he and she, but he's not going to change, and I'm choosing to step out of the relationship. So no addict is willing to get help until the pain of change is less than the pain of staying the same. So as long as that, things can be manipulated, and even if if partners are unhappy and they're saying that and perceived nagging, what, they're used to that, because I'm still going to hang on to these things. So that's the challenge. And this is always, for me, to partners, like, healthy boundaries for you or taking care of you, because you aren't going to change him. And many addicts, come to us and they'll say, if I had gotten help, I didn't have to lose my first marriage because, like I've made a shambles of multiple relationships now. So, but not everybody, ever, gets that awareness and understanding. So, okay, one more question, and it's only because it's a brain damage question. Is it possible for permanent brain damage from a 20-year compulsive masturbation and porn addiction? Towards the end, began watching porn for days on end, and I feel like I fried my system. I've been sober for years, but struggle with the after effects. And I don't hear substances in there here, so that's why I wanted to ask you this one.
Yeah, I think, I think as we understand it, kind of brain damage per se, I don't think that's probably likely, but I think we do get into different thought patterns of thinking and concentration. And I'm not sure if there's maybe some ADHD here or stuff underneath. It's very common with a lot of addictive disorders. So I would suspect there's stuff that maybe was there before that's been aggravated by the addictive behavior. And I would suggest different kinds of therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, or DBT, we call it dialectical behavioral therapy. There are ways that you can sort of look at your thought processes and start to reconfigure them. So I would really start with that. You can go through like the neuropsych evaluations, which are very expensive and last for days, and probably figure out exactly if there is or not. But I suspect probably not. Unless there's some other factor that it's not in the question here. But I think just really working with somebody to reorder your thoughts would be probably very productive.
Thank you for that. Thanks for all the great questions and everybody joining. Email if you've got questions for Dr. David at seekingintegrity.com. He'll be back in a few months, but you can check out the chemsex guys can check out the chemsex, and that is not just gay men, meth, sex, like it's any male using co-occurring substances and sex porn addiction. So check that one out. And Kristin Snowden will be here the end of July, and I will get something posted for the August second week. I don't have it yet. It's going to be a surprise to you because it's going to be a surprise to me. So thanks, everyone. Thanks, Dr. David.
Okay. Thanks.
Bye.